April 6, 1945, 1,500 feet above the East China Sea. Lieutenant Nakamura Kenji rolls his Zero into a 70-degree dive. Below him, the gray shapes of American warships cut white wakes through blue water. His target is clear, a carrier, massive, vulnerable. He tightens his grip on the stick. The engine screams. The altimeter unwinds. 1,000 feet, 800. The ship grows larger in his gun sight. He steadies his breathing. This is what he trained for, what he promised. Then, without warning, the ocean vanishes. The ships vanish. The horizon vanishes. Everything below him dissolves into a wall of white. Not clouds, not mist. Something else. Something unnatural. He pulls up hard, heart pounding, searching for visual reference. There is none. Only whiteness, silence, and the terrible realization that he is flying blind. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had become a calculable nightmare for Imperial Japan. The Navy had lost its dominance at Midway, its strategic reach at Guadalcanal, and its industrial lifeline in the Philippine Sea. American forces advanced island by island, each conquest bringing B-29 bombers closer to the home islands. Japan's carrier fleet, once the most powerful in the world, was reduced to scattered remnants hiding in fuel-starved anchorages. Surface engagements, once the pride of the combined fleet, had become suicide missions. The doctrine that had propelled Japan to early victories, superior training, aggressive offense, technological edge, had eroded into desperation. In October 1944, facing inevitable defeat, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed a radical solution: organized suicide attacks. The Kamikaze, divine wind, pilots would transform their aircraft into guided missiles, diving directly into enemy ships. No need for precision bombing, no need for return fuel. Just the aircraft, the explosive payload, and the will. Willingness to die. The philosophy was simple and horrifying. A single plane piloted by a determined man could sink a carrier, cripple a battleship, demoralize an entire fleet. It was a weapon born not of innovation, but of exhaustion. The first kamikaze units formed quickly. Young pilots, many barely trained, volunteered or were volunteered. They were given ceremonial headbands, cups of sake, and final letters to write home. Their targets were always the same: aircraft carriers, the floating air bases that projected American power across the Pacific. Without carriers, the U.S. advance would stall. That was the theory. The reality proved more complex. American carrier task forces operated as layered fortresses. Combat air patrol fighters circled overhead, guided by radar. Anti-aircraft guns bristled from every ship. Destroyers formed protective rings around the high-value targets. Fire control systems had improved dramatically since Pearl Harbor. Proximity fuse shells detonated near aircraft without direct hits. Interlocking fields of fire created kill zones miles wide. Yet despite all this, kamikazes got through. On October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the escort carrier USS St. Lo became the first major warship sunk by a kamikaze. The attack took less than 90 seconds. The carrier exploded, broke apart, and sank within 30 minutes. Over 100 men died. The loss sent shockwaves through the U.S. Navy. If one pilot could destroy a carrier, what would 50 do? 100? Intelligence reports indicated Japan was marshaling thousands of aircraft for final defense operations. Radar could detect incoming raids, but it couldn't stop a pilot willing to die. Fighters could intercept some attackers, but not all. Anti-aircraft fire could shoot down planes, but determined pilots often broke through. The Navy needed something else. Something that didn't require shooting down every single attacker. Something that removed the kamikaze's greatest advantage, the ability to see its target. The solution came not from weapons designers, but from chemical engineers. Smokescreens were not new to naval warfare. Destroyers had used funnel smoke to obscure movement since World War I. Chemical smoke generators had been deployed in land battles throughout the 1930s. But the Pacific War demanded something unprecedented in scale and speed. A task force under air attack needed to disappear within minutes, across miles of ocean, in unpredictable wind conditions. The smoke had to be dense enough to block visual targeting from altitude, persistent enough to last through sustained raids, and safe enough not to incapacitate friendly crews. It was an engineering challenge that fell to the Navy's Bureau of Ships and the Chemical Warfare Service. The primary compound chosen was FS smoke, a sulfur trioxide mixture that reacted with atmospheric moisture to create thick white fog. When heated and released from shipboard generators, it produced clouds that could blanket entire formations. Secondary systems used titanium tetrachloride and white phosphorus, both of which created instant opacity but carried higher toxicity risks. The generators themselves were compact units installed on destroyers, destroyer escorts, and specialized smoke ships. Each unit could produce smoke for 30 to 40 minutes continuously. Multiple ships operating in coordination could create barriers over a mile wide and hundreds of feet high. The tactical doctrine developed rapidly. When radar detected incoming raids, designated smoke ships would maneuver to windward positions relative to the carriers. On command, they would ignite their generators and begin laying smoke. The wind would carry the fog across the task force, creating a drifting wall between the attackers and their targets. The timing was critical. Released too early and the smoke would dissipate before the attackers arrived. Too late and the Japanese pilots would already have visual acquisition. The ideal deployment created smoke that reached maximum density just as enemy aircraft entered attack range. The first large-scale test came during Operations Off Leyte in late 1944. Kamikaze raids struck daily and losses mounted. On November 27, Task Group 38.2 came under attack by 15 aircraft. As the raid approached, 4 destroyers initiated smokescreen procedures. Within 6 minutes, a fog bank half a mile wide rolled across the formation. Japanese pilots diving from 8,000 feet lost sight of their targets at 2,000 feet. Several pulled out of their dives blindly. 2 crashed into the ocean. 3 were shot down by fighters as they climbed back through the smoke silhouetted against the clear sky above. Not a single ship was hit. The results were analyzed immediately. Post-action reports noted that while smoke reduced visibility for everyone, including friendly forces, it disproportionately affected attackers. American ships had radar to maintain formation and vector fighters. Japanese pilots trained for visual bombing and lacking sophisticated instruments became disoriented. Even those who penetrated the smoke often emerged too low or off-angle to execute controlled dives. The psychological effect was equally significant. Pilots who survived reported extreme frustration and fear. Diving into white emptiness, not knowing if they would hit water, a ship, or nothing at all, shattered the focus required for suicide attacks. By December 1944, smokescreen doctrine was standard across the Pacific Fleet. Destroyers practiced deployment drills. Wind analysis became part of pre-raid briefings. Chemical supply chains expanded to keep every task force stocked. The equipment was refined continuously. Early generators sometimes malfunctioned or produced inconsistent density. Improved models incorporated automatic igniters and flow regulators. Training emphasized coordination. A poorly placed smoke ship could obscure friendly gun sites or interfere with AI. Aircraft recovery. Done correctly, smoke became an invisible shield, reshaping the geometry of naval combat without firing a shot. Japan's intelligence services noticed the change quickly. Pilot debriefs mentioned white fog appearing suddenly during attacks. Returning aircrews described missions aborted because targets disappeared, but Japanese commanders had no effective countermeasure. Their pilots lacked the instrument training to attack through zero visibility. Radar-equipped aircraft were rare and reserved for reconnaissance. Low-altitude approaches under the smoke layer were suggested, but these exposed attackers to devastating point-blank anti-aircraft fire. The smoke remained an unsolvable problem, a wall that could not be breached, only endured. As 1945 began, the U.S. Navy prepared for the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, the invasion of Okinawa. Intelligence predicted Japan would throw everything remaining into defending the island. Thousands of aircraft, waves of kamikazes, attacks that would last weeks, perhaps months. The fleet knew smokescreens would be tested like never before. Every destroyer was equipped, every crew drilled. The invisible wall was about to face its greatest trial. Flight Petty Officer Ichiro Yamada climbed into his cockpit on April 12, 1945, knowing he would not return. His aircraft was a D-4Y Suisei, a dive bomber modified to carry a single 550-pound bomb internally. He had trained for 3 weeks, not on advanced tactics or evasive maneuvers, but on diving angles and final approaches. His instructors were blunt. He would have one chance. Pick a target, dive, do not pull out. The briefing before launch was procedural. American carriers were operating 60 miles east of Okinawa. Weather was clear, visibility excellent. He would approach from the northwest using the sun. The formation would scatter once they encountered. Air defensive fire. Each pilot would select his own target. There was no backup plan. Yamada reached the target area at 14,000 feet. Below him, the American fleet spread across the ocean like a moving city. Carriers in the center, destroyers in rings, white wakes everywhere. He selected a carrier, the largest he could see. He nosed over, began his dive, and watched the ship grow in his windscreen. Then the whiteness came, not gradually, instantly, as if someone had thrown a curtain across the ocean. He kept diving, trusting his angle, but the altimeter was spinning and he had no reference point. Panic crept in. He was flying into nothing. If he stayed in the dive, he might hit water at 400 miles per hour. If he pulled out, he would abort the mission, dishonor his unit, waste his death. He pulled out. Climbing back through the smoke, he broke into sunlight at 3,000 feet. His fuel was burning low. Other aircraft circled, equally confused. No orders came over the radio. They had expected flak, fighters, even collision with other kamikazes. Not this. Not blindness. Yamada circled once more, searching for a gap in the white wall, but it stretched for miles. Eventually, he turned northwest back toward Kyushu. He landed with a quarter tank remaining. His commander said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had failed to die. 3 days later, he was assigned to another mission. This time, there would be no smoke, or so they hoped. Dr. Harold Richter never imagined his work would save lives. As a chemist with the National Defense Research Committee, he had spent 2 years studying industrial smoke production for obscuring factories from bombers. His expertise was in particle density, dispersion rates, and atmospheric stability. In early 1944, he was reassigned to a Navy project with a single directive: create a shipboard system that could generate visual barriers in open ocean conditions. The parameters were strict. The smoke to form within minutes, persist for at least 20 minutes, remain effective in winds up to 15 knots, and cause minimal harm to personnel. It also had to be producible in massive quantities using materials available in the Pacific Theater. Richter's team tested dozens of compounds. Sulfur trioxide showed immediate promise. When vaporized and released into humid air, it reacted violently with moisture, creating hygroscopic particles that expanded into dense clouds. The particles were small enough to remain suspended for extended periods, but large enough to scatter visible light almost completely. Lab tests showed opacity levels exceeding 95% at densities achievable with portable generators. The problem was containment. Sulfur trioxide was corrosive, toxic in concentrated form, and required careful handling. The team designed sealed canisters with controlled heating elements. When activated, the mixture would vaporize and vent through nozzles positioned to maximize dispersal. Field trials began in June 1944 off the California coast. A destroyer escort, USS Riddle, was fitted with prototype generators. During tests, the ship produced smoke clouds visible from 10 miles away. Aircraft flying overhead reported complete visual obstruction below 3,000 feet. The system worked, but refinements were needed. Early generators clogged. Wind shifts sometimes blew smoke back across friendly ships, causing respiratory irritation. Crew safety protocols were developed: masks for operators, ventilation adjustments, positioning guidelines to keep smoke downwind. By September, the system was ready for combat deployment. Richter never went to the Pacific, but he read every after-action report. Each one validated his work in ways no laboratory test could. Ships that should have been sunk were still afloat. Pilots who should have hit their targets were crashing into the sea. The smoke was doing exactly what he designed it to do, removing certainty from the attacker's equation. In a war defined by firepower and attrition, his contribution was absence. The absence of visibility, the absence of targets, the absence of death. Seaman First Class Tommy Briggs stood at his station aboard USS Laffey, a destroyer assigned to Radar Picket Station 1, 50 miles north of Okinawa. It was April 16, 1945, and the ship had already survived 3 days of near-constant air attacks. Briggs's job was not to fire guns or track radar. He operated the smoke generator mounted amidships. It was a cylindrical unit, 4 feet tall, connected to fuel lines and an electrical ignition system. When the order came, he would flip 2 switches, monitor the temperature gauge, and ensure the smoke flowed without interruption. It sounded simple. In practice, it required absolute focus under conditions of chaos. The morning had been quiet until 0830 hours when radar detected a large raid inbound, 50-plus contacts. The alarm sounded. Briggs ran to his station, heart hammering. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Prepare smoke screen, stand by." Briggs checked his equipment, fuel pressure good, igniter armed. He waited. The first wave of kamikazes appeared as dots on the horizon, growing rapidly. Fighters engaged them, but several broke through. At 0844, the order came. Execute smoke. Briggs flipped the switches. The generator roared to life, heat radiating from the casing. White smoke poured from the vent, thick and acrid, streaming behind the ship as it maneuvered into the wind. Within minutes, Faye was enveloped. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Briggs could barely see the superstructure. The sound of gunfire was deafening, but he couldn't see what they were shooting at. Explosions echoed across the water. Something hit close enough to spray the deck with seawater. The ship shuddered. Briggs kept his eyes on the gauges. Temperature climbing, fuel flow steady. The generator couldn't stop, not yet. The smoke was their only shield. Around him, the battle raged invisible. He heard aircraft engines overhead, some diving, some pulling away. More explosions, screams. Orders shouted, but the smoke kept flowing thick and relentless, turning the ocean into a blank page. When the all-clear finally sounded at 0947, Briggs shut down the generator. The smoke drifted away slowly. As visibility returned, he saw the damage. Holes in the deck, fires being extinguished, wounded sailors being carried below. But Laffey was still afloat, still fighting. The smoke had worked, not perfectly, not without cost, but enough. Later, the captain addressed the crew. They had been attacked by 22 aircraft. They had shot down 9. They had been hit 5 times but remained operational. Without the smoke, he said, they would be at the bottom of the ocean. Briggs didn't feel like a hero. He had just operated a machine, but he understood in that moment that survival sometimes came not from courage, but from being invisible. The technological imbalance between American and Japanese forces in 1945 extended far beyond firepower. It was an imbalance of perception. American ships were equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar systems that could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The SK and SM radar sets mounted on cruisers and carriers provided early warning that allowed combat air patrol fighters to intercept raids before they reached the fleet. Fire control radar guided anti-aircraft guns with precision even at night or in poor visibility. Ships could maintain formation in total darkness using surface search radar. The U.S. Navy had learned to fight without relying solely on human eyesight. Japan possessed radar technology, but in limited quantities and inferior performance. Most aircraft carried no onboard radar whatsoever. Pilots relied on visual navigation, visual target identification, and visual bombing. Training emphasized keen eyesight and memorization of ship silhouettes. Instructors taught students to identify carrier types from altitude by counting flight deck elevators and island structures. This visual dependency had worked well in the early war when Japan controlled vast territories and could stage attacks from land bases with clear weather. But by 1945, these same pilots were being asked to attack heavily defended fleets across open ocean, often flying through clouds, flak, and now artificial fog. The smokescreens exploited this asymmetry ruthlessly. When a kamikaze pilot entered a smoke cloud, he lost his primary combat sense. His training became useless. Without visual reference, he couldn't judge altitude accurately. Airspeed indicators and altimeters existed, but few pilots trusted them under stress. The human eye was supposed to be the ultimate instrument. Now it was blinded. Meanwhile, the American ships below tracked him perfectly on radar. The Puss. I knew his altitude, speed, and bearing even when he couldn't see them. Fighters were vectored to intercept him as he circled, confused and exposed. Anti-aircraft crews fired into the smoke, guided by radar predictors, hitting targets they couldn't see with their own eyes. Japanese commanders recognized the problem but had no solution. Instrument flying required extensive training and sophisticated cockpit equipment. Both were in desperately short supply. Some units attempted nighttime attacks, hoping darkness would negate the smoke advantage, but American radar made night attacks suicidal. Others tried saturation tactics, sending so many aircraft that some would inevitably find gaps in the smoke. This worked occasionally, but at horrific cost. Of every 10 kamikazes launched, 7 or 8 failed to reach their targets. Many were shot down. Many became disoriented and crashed. A few aborted and returned, carrying the shame of survival. The smoke had turned the ocean into a maze where only one side could see the walls. There were moments of brutal irony. American ships occasionally found themselves blinded by their own smoke when wind shifted unexpectedly. Gun crews would lose sight of attacking aircraft just as they entered firing range. Fighters returning to carriers would struggle to find the fleet through the fog. These incidents caused losses and frustration, but they were temporary inconveniences compared to what Japanese pilots faced. American ships could secure from smoke and regain visibility within minutes. Japanese pilots, once they entered the White Wall, often never regained it. They flew blind until they ran out of fuel or into the ocean. The technological gap had become a perceptual chasm, and smoke was the edge of the abyss. The kamikaze was not simply a tactical weapon, it was a psychological contract. A pilot who volunteered or accepted assignment entered into an understanding with his commanders, his family, his nation, and himself. He would die, but his death would have meaning. It would damage the enemy. It would honor his ancestors. It would prove that Japanese spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The entire system depended on this certainty. A kamikaze pilot was not expected to return, but he was expected to hit his target. That was the minimum requirement for his death to have value. Without impact, without destruction, the death became waste, empty, unbearable. Smoke screens shattered this psychological contract. When a pilot dove into white nothingness and emerged having hit nothing, he faced an existential crisis. He had prepared to die. He had said goodbye. He had crossed the mental threshold. But instead of the expected end, he found himself alive, circling in the sky, low on fuel with no target and no purpose. Some pilots made second attempts, diving blindly, hoping for collision. Most pulled out, survival instinct overriding training. Those who returned to base faced unbearable shame. They had wasted their death. Some requested immediate reassignment to another mission. Others quietly disappeared, whether through suicide or unofficial transfers. Records do not always clarify. The smoke also affected pilots who had not yet flown. Debriefs from survivors spread through units quickly. Stories of impenetrable fog, of diving into whiteness and finding nothing circulated in barracks and mess halls. These stories eroded the certainty that made the kamikaze system function. Pilots began to doubt, not their willingness to die, but whether dying would accomplish anything. If the target was invisible, if hitting it was a matter of luck rather than skill, then what was the point? The ritual purity of the kamikaze, the idea that determination could overcome any defense, was being replaced by randomness. Some pilots openly questioned whether suicide attacks should continue. These questions were dangerous, bordering on insubordination, but commanders had no effective rebuttal. The smoke was undeniable. Japanese military culture had always emphasized spirit over material, the samurai ethos, the concept of fighting spirit, the belief that willpower could compensate for technological inferiority. These ideas were deeply embedded in training and doctrine, but smoke exposed the limits of spirit. No amount of determination could help a pilot see through chemical fog. No amount of courage could compensate for flying blind. The Americans had found a weapon that didn't challenge Japanese spirit directly. It simply made spirit irrelevant. This was psychologically devastating in ways that losses from gunfire or fighter attacks were not. A pilot shot down by a Hellcat died honorably in combat. A pilot who aborted because he couldn't see his target died without honor if he died at all. By May 1945, kamikaze effectiveness had declined sharply. Some of this was due to improved American defenses across all categories: more fighters, better flak, enhanced radar. But smoke played a unique role. It didn't destroy aircraft or kill pilots. It destroyed certainty. It destroyed the psychological foundation that made young men willing to fly one-way missions. When American intelligence officers interrogated captured Japanese airmen after the war, many mentioned smoke as the most demoralizing element of the final months. Not the most deadly, not the most frightening, the most demoralizing, because it turned their sacrifice into absurdity. The smokescreen was never a perfect weapon. It carried costs, some anticipated, some discovered through painful experience. The most immediate was toxicity. FS smoke, while less lethal than white phosphorus, still contained sulfuric acid particles. Prolonged exposure caused respiratory irritation, coughing, and in severe cases, chemical burns to the lungs. Sailors operating generators wore protective masks, but many other crew members were exposed as smoke drifted across decks. Medical logs from ships deploying smoke frequently note increased sick call for breathing problems. Some men developed chronic conditions that persisted long after the war. The Navy considered this acceptable. Chemical irritation was preferable to kamikaze impact. Visibility reduction affected everyone, not just attackers. During smoke operations, ships often lost visual contact with each other. Formations relied entirely on radar and radio communication to avoid collisions. This worked most of the time, but not always. On April 27, 1945, two destroyers operating in smoke off Okinawa nearly collided when one misjudged the other's position. Only emergency maneuvering prevented disaster. Aircraft returning from combat missions sometimes struggled to locate their carriers through smoke. Several planes ditched in the ocean when they couldn't find the fleet before running out of fuel. Recovery operations for downed pilots became more difficult when smoke obscured the water. These incidents were tallied as operational costs, acceptable given the alternative. Friendly fire increased in smoke conditions. Anti-aircraft gunners, unable to see targets clearly, sometimes fired at silhouettes that turned out to be American aircraft. The smoke created visual confusion that Japanese pilots weren't the only ones suffering from. One particularly tragic incident occurred on May 4, 1945, when a damaged Hellcat attempting an emergency landing flew through smoke surrounding its carrier. Nervous gunners, conditioned to fire at anything moving through the fog, opened up. The pilot was killed before he could identify himself. Investigations followed, but no one was truly at fault. The smoke created ambiguity, and ambiguity killed. The Navy accepted this as the price of the tactic. There were also logistical costs. Smoke generators required constant maintenance. The sulfur compounds corroded components rapidly. Replacement parts and chemical supplies had to be shipped across thousands of miles of ocean. Every destroyer carrying smoke equipment sacrificed space that could have been used for ammunition or fuel. Dedicated smoke ships were even more specialized, carrying minimal armament to maximize smoke production capacity. These vessels were vulnerable, requiring escort and protection while performing their screening duties. The chemical supply chain became a critical element of fleet logistics, prioritized alongside food, fuel, and ordnance. Weather complicated everything. High winds dispersed smoke too quickly, rendering it ineffective. Calm conditions caused smoke to linger and spread unpredictably, sometimes obscuring friendly positions. Rain could wash particles out of the air, thinning the fog. Temperature inversions created layers where smoke wouldn't rise or fall as expected. Meteorologists became essential to smoke operations, analyzing wind patterns and advising on optimal deployment timing. Despite all this science, smoke remained unpredictable. Commanders learned to treat it as a probability, not a guarantee. Sometimes it worked perfectly, sometimes it failed completely, but even imperfect smoke was better than none at all. The final cost was strategic visibility. Smoke that concealed ships from attackers also concealed attackers from ships. Radar tracked incoming raids, but visual identification of aircraft type and intent became impossible in smoke. This occasionally allowed Japanese reconnaissance planes to observe fleets undetected, or damaged kamikazes to escape when they might have been finished off. The fog was a double-edged weapon, and both sides understood this. But in the brutal arithmetic of 1945, the Americans had more edges to spare. April 6, 1945. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, was 3 days old. American forces had secured beachheads on the western coast of the island, meeting lighter resistance than expected. But Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, knew the real battle was just beginning. Intelligence had warned of Kikusui No. 1, the first of 10 planned mass kamikaze operations. Japan was preparing to hurl hundreds of aircraft at the invasion fleet in a coordinated wave designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer volume. Every available plane, from modern Zeros to obsolete trainers, would be thrown into the attack. The goal was not tactical precision, but catastrophic attrition. Sink enough ships, and the invasion would collapse. The attack began at dawn. Radar screens aboard picket destroyers stationed north of Okinawa lit up with contacts. Dozens. Then more. By 0630 hours, operators were tracking over 180 inbound aircraft. The picket line, a screen of 16 destroyers and destroyer escorts positioned to provide early warning, was about to face the full fury of Japan's desperation. These ships, small and lightly armored, were the most exposed units in the fleet. They had no carriers to hide behind, no battleship armor to absorb hits. Their mission was to detect, report, and survive. In that order, USS Bush, a Fletcher-class destroyer, held Radar Picket Station 1 along with USS Calhoun. Commander Roland Smoot, commanding Bush, watched the radar returns multiply and knew what was coming. He ordered general quarters at 0645 hours. Within minutes, the first wave appeared on the horizon. Not a tight formation, but a scattered mob of aircraft approaching from multiple directions. Some were kamikazes, some were escorts, some were simply lost. Smoot ordered smoke prepared but held the command to deploy. The wind was light and variable. Too early and the smoke would dissipate uselessly. Too late and they'd be hit before it formed. The first attackers arrived at 0715 hours, 4 Zeros diving from 8,000 feet. Combat air patrol fighters engaged, splashing 2 immediately. The remaining 2 pressed through. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, black bursts tracking the diving planes. 1 Zero took hits, trailing smoke, but kept coming. It struck Bush amidships, penetrating the deck and exploding in the forward engine room. The ship shuddered, losing power. Fires erupted. Damage control teams rushed forward, but the ship was crippled. More aircraft appeared. Smoot, bleeding from shrapnel, gave the order he'd been holding. Make smoke. All available units. Calhoun, still maneuvering freely, activated her smoke generators at 0722 hours. White fog poured from her stern, spreading rapidly across the water. Two nearby LCS gunboats, small support vessels equipped with portable smoke pots, added to the screen. Within 4 minutes, a curtain of chemical fog stretched nearly a mile, drifting northeast on the light wind. Bush dead in the water and burning was partially obscured. Calhoun maneuvered to place herself between the smoke and the wind, maintaining the barrier. The timing was critical. Even as the smoke thickened, more kamikazes were inbound. At 729 hours, 3 Val's obsolete dive bombers pressed into suicide service approached from the south. They had clear visibility of the ships initially, beginning their dives from 7,500 feet. But as they descended through 4,000 feet, they entered the smoke layer. The lead pilot, committed to his dive, disappeared into the white. His wingman followed. For nearly 15 seconds, the sky was silent except for the roar of engines somewhere inside the fog. Then, nothing. No explosions, no impacts. The aircraft had either pulled out blindly or crashed into the ocean beyond the formation. Radar tracked them circling, disoriented, climbing back into clear air. Cap fighters, guided by radar controllers who could see through the fog electronically, vectored onto the confused aircraft. 2 were shot down within a minute, the third fled northwest. The respite was brief. At 0736 hours, a massive coordinated strike arrived. 15 aircraft, a mix of Zeros and Oscars, attacking from 3 directions simultaneously. The smokescreen, effective against small groups, couldn't cover all approaches. Several kamikazes found Bush through gaps in the fog. 2 more hits shattered the destroyer. The ship began listing heavily. Smoot ordered abandoned ship at 0748 hours. Sailors leaped into the oil-slicked water as Bush rolled over and sank. Calhoun continued fighting, her guns firing into the smoke at radar-designated targets. She shot down 3 aircraft in 4 minutes, but the volume was overwhelming. Then the smoke did something unexpected. As more generators activated and the fog thickened, it began to drift not just across the target area but upward, rising on thermal currents created by burning ships and warm morning air. The result was a 3-dimensional wall that extended from sea level to nearly 2,000 feet. Japanese pilots diving from altitude found themselves blind not just near the surface but throughout the entire attack profile. Several pilots, recognizing the impossibility, aborted their dives at high altitude and turned away. This was noted immediately by American observers. The smoke wasn't just obscuring targets. It was breaking pilot resolve before they even committed to the attack. By 08:15 hours, the initial wave had expended itself. Bush was gone. Calhoun, hit twice more, was sinking, but 8 other ships in the picket line had survived unscathed, primarily because smoke had concealed them during the critical minutes when the largest kamikaze groups attacked. The losses were terrible, but the mathematics were in America's favor. Japan had launched 182 aircraft in the first Kikusui operation. Fewer than 30 reached the main invasion fleet. The picket line, reinforced by smoke, had absorbed and blunted the assault. It was a brutal, costly success, but it was success nonetheless. As morning turned to afternoon, subsequent waves attacked. The pattern repeated. Radar detected raids, smoke ships deployed, kamikazes dove into fog and emerged having hit nothing or didn't emerge at all. By 1400 hours, the tactical picture was clear. Smoke screens, combined with fighter interception and anti-aircraft fire, had reduced kamikaze effectiveness to levels Japan could not sustain. The divine wind was blowing against an invisible wall, and the wall was holding. Admiral Spruance, reviewing reports that evening aboard USS New Mexico, noted the smokescreen performance with clinical precision. Ships equipped with smoke had suffered a 40% lower hit rate than those without. More significantly, ships obscured by smoke from adjacent vessels had a 60% lower hit rate. The implications were strategic. If smoke could be deployed fleet-wide, kamikaze attacks would shift from catastrophic threat to manageable attrition. He ordered smoke capability expanded immediately. Every available destroyer would be fitted. Chemical stockpiles would be tripled. Doctrine would be refined. The invisible wall would become standard, not experimental. That night, in airfields across Kyushu, Japanese pilots gathered for debriefs. The reports were consistent and damning. White fog everywhere, targets disappearing mid-attack, pilots pulling out blind, aircraft lost to confusion rather than combat. One survivor, a veteran of 30 missions who had volunteered for kamikaze duty, sat silently through the briefing. When his commander asked for his assessment, he said only this: "We cannot hit what we cannot see. We are diving into nothing." No one contradicted him. The smoke had done more than protect ships. It had revealed the futility of the entire kamikaze strategy when faced with an enemy that could simply vanish. The success of April 6th was not an endpoint but a beginning. Japan responded to the first Kikusui failure by intensifying planning for the second. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding 5th Air Fleet, analyzed the smokescreen problem with cold pragmatism. His pilots could not bomb what they could not see. Visual targeting was non-negotiable given equipment limitations. Therefore, the solution was timing and saturation. Smoke required minutes to form and dispersed eventually. If attacks came in rapid succession from multiple directions, some aircraft would catch ships before smoke deployed or after it thinned. If enough planes attacked simultaneously, sheer numbers would overwhelm the screen's coverage. On April 12th, Kikusui No. 2 launched with these principles embedded in the operational plan. 185 aircraft departed Kyushu airbases starting at 0630 hours. They were organized into 3 waves separated by 30-minute intervals, each wave subdivided into smaller groups approaching from different compass points. The strategy was to force American smoke ships into constant deployment, exhausting their chemical supplies and creating gaps in coverage. Additionally, some aircraft were assigned to attack at dawn and dusk when low sun angles might penetrate smoke that would be opaque at midday. It was the most sophisticated kamikaze operation yet attempted, designed specifically to counter the invisible wall. The first wave struck radar picket Station 1 again at 08:15 hours. This time, the picket destroyers had been reinforced. USS Manert L. Abel, USS Jeffers, and 4 LCS gunboats formed a mutually supporting group with overlapping smoke coverage. When radar detected the inbound raid, all 6 vessels began smoke generation simultaneously. The coordination was precise. Each ship positioned itself to create interlocking fog banks that covered not individual vessels but the entire formation. Within 7 minutes, a smoke wall over 2 miles wide stretched across the approach corridor. The Japanese pilots, expecting smoke based on previous reports, attempted their countermeasure. Instead of diving immediately, they circled at altitude, searching for gaps, but the Americans had anticipated this. Cap fighters, guided by radar that saw clearly through the smoke, used the circling aircraft as target practice. 4 kamikazes were shot down before they could even attempt attacks. The remaining pilots, under pressure, dove into the smoke, hoping to break through to clear air below. Most found only more fog. 1-0 emerged from the smoke inverted, completely disoriented, and crashed into the ocean. Another pulled up so violently to avoid hitting water that the aircraft stalled and spun in. But 2 kamikazes succeeded through sheer luck and determination. At 08:27 hours, a Judy dive bomber descended through a gap in the smoke created by a temporary wind shift. The pilot spotted Manert L. Abel and adjusted his dive instantly. The destroyer's gunners saw him too late. The aircraft struck the ship's port side at the waterline. The explosion was catastrophic, breaking the destroyer's keel. She sank in less than 5 minutes, so rapidly that many crew members went down with the ship. 49 men died. The smoke had failed not because of tactical error, but because wind was unpredictable. Minutes later, Japan unveiled a new weapon designed specifically to defeat smoke. At 08:31 hours, observers aboard Jeffers reported an unusual aircraft approaching at low altitude. It was an Oka, a rocket-powered piloted bomb released from a bomber and guided to its target. Unlike conventional aircraft, the Oka accelerated in its final approach to over 500 miles per hour, making interception nearly impossible. The pilot released from the mother plane at 15,000 feet and dove toward the smoke-shrouded formation. But even the Oka's speed couldn't compensate for zero visibility. The pilot entered the smoke at 3,000 feet and never emerged. Radar tracked the weapon's trajectory, ending in the ocean 200 yards from any ship. The technological innovation had been negated by chemical fog. The second wave arrived at 09:10 hours, targeting the main fleet anchorage off Higuchi Beach. Here, dozens of transports, cargo ships, and amphibious vessels unloaded supplies in shallow water. These ships were clustered tightly, difficult to obscure completely. But the Navy had deployed specialized smoke ships, converted LSTs equipped with oversized generators. As the kamikaze wave approached, these vessels activated, creating a smoke curtain that stretched along 3 miles of coastline. The effect was surreal. An entire invasion beach disappeared behind white fog, as if the island itself had vanished. Japanese pilots arriving overhead circled in confusion. Some attacked blindly, diving into the smoke and hoping to hit something. Most hit water or empty beach. One aircraft struck an LST that had moved forward of the smoke line, causing moderate damage. Another, attempting to fly beneath the smoke layer at low altitude, was obliterated by a withering crossfire from every ship in the anchorage. The massed anti-aircraft fire was so intense that even friendly observers described it as a solid wall of metal. Combined with the visual obstruction, the defenses were impenetrable. Of 18 aircraft in the wave, 16 were destroyed without achieving significant damage. The third wave, arriving at 10:30 hours, targeted picket stations to the north. By this time, American smoke doctrine had evolved further. Instead of waiting for attacks to begin, destroyers deployed smoke preemptively based on radar detection alone. This meant kamikazes arrived to find targets already obscured. The psychological effect was immediate. Several pilots, seeing only fog below, abandoned their missions entirely and turned back. Others circled uselessly, burning fuel until cap fighters arrived. One group of 5 kamikazes, led by an experienced flight leader, attempted a coordinated attack through the smoke from different altitudes simultaneously. The theory was that at least one aircraft would find clear air at some level. The attempt failed spectacularly. The low-altitude aircraft flew into point-blank anti-aircraft fire and was destroyed instantly. The medium-altitude aircraft entered smoke so thick that the pilot became vertically disoriented, pulling out parallel to the ocean surface instead of perpendicular, and cartwheeled into the water. The high-altitude aircraft dove through the entire smoke layer, emerging below it but so low and so fast that pulling out was impossible. It struck the ocean at over 400 miles per hour, the impact visible as a massive waterspout. The 2 remaining aircraft aborted. The coordinated attack, planned and rehearsed, had collapsed into chaos within seconds. By noon, Kikusui No. 2 was effectively over. Japan had launched 185 aircraft. Approximately 140 were destroyed by fighters, anti-aircraft fire, or operational accidents. Of the remainder, most aborted or returned without attacking. Only 11 ships were hit, and of those, only 3 were sunk. The exchange ratio was catastrophic for Japan. They were losing aircraft and irreplaceable pilots at a rate that could not be sustained. American losses, while painful, were manageable. The fleet continued operating. The invasion continued advancing. The smokescreens had held against a sophisticated, determined assault. That afternoon, Japanese naval headquarters received reports from returning pilots. The accounts were uniformly bleak. One pilot's report, later captured and translated, stated, "The enemy has made the ocean into a battlefield where vision means nothing. We dive toward targets we cannot see through fog that has no end. Some of us strike water. Some of us strike ships by accident. Most of us strike nothing. This is not warfare. This is blindness fighting air." The report was filed without comment, but its implications were understood. The kamikaze, conceived as a weapon of certainty and shihin, his spirit had been reduced to a weapon of random chance. Admiral Ugaki, reading these reports in his command bunker, made a decision. Future kamikaze operations would prioritize targets outside smoke coverage, isolated destroyers, ships separated from formations, vessels caught during weather that dispersed fog. The mass attacks against smoke-protected fleets would continue because Japan had no alternative, but expectations were adjusted downward. The goal was no longer to sink enough ships to halt the invasion. It was simply to inflict enough damage to make the Americans reconsider the cost of future operations. The smoke had not ended the kamikaze threat, but it had fundamentally altered the strategic equation. As evening approached on April 12th, USS Laffey, the destroyer that would later become legendary for surviving the largest single-ship kamikaze attack of the war, sat at Radar Picket Station 1. Her crew had watched the day's battle unfold, had seen the smoke save some ships and fail others, and understood that tomorrow they might face the same test. Seaman Briggs, standing by the smoke generator he had operated that morning, looked out at the now clear ocean. The sun was setting, painting the water orange and red. In a few hours, it would be dark. In a few more, dawn. And with dawn, inevitably, more aircraft, more smoke, more survival measured in minutes and visibility measured in feet. The invisible wall had held today. Whether it would hold tomorrow was a question no one could answer, but it was the only wall they had. The statistics compiled in the weeks following April 12th told a story that transformed American naval doctrine. During the first 2 Kikusui operations, Japanese forces launched a combined 367 aircraft against the Okinawa invasion fleet. Of these, 291 were destroyed by fighters, anti-aircraft fire, or operational failure. 76 reached attack positions. Of those 76, only 19 achieved hits on ships. 14 vessels were sunk, 23 damaged. In raw numbers, the Kamikaze remained dangerous. But when compared to earlier operations before widespread smoke deployment, the effectiveness had dropped by nearly 60%. Ships operating within smoke coverage had a survival rate almost 3 times higher than those caught outside it. The human cost was still severe. Over 800 American sailors died during those first 2 operations. Thousands more were wounded, many suffering burns, shrapnel injuries, and trauma that would never fully heal. Hospital ships anchored off Okinawa overflowed with casualties. Medical personnel worked in continuous shifts performing amputations, treating shock, fighting infections and wounds contaminated by seawater and burning oil. The sailors who survived smoke-protected ships understood they had been lucky. Those pulled from the water after their ships sank understood that luck had limits. But across the fleet, a realization settled in. Smoke worked. Not perfectly, not without cost, but measurably, demonstrably, undeniably. Japanese losses were catastrophic in different ways. The aircraft could theoretically be replaced, though Japan's industrial capacity was collapsing under strategic bombing. The pilots could not be replaced at all. Each kamikaze who died without hitting a target represented months of training, irreplaceable experience, and a wasted life in the most literal sense. By mid-April 1945, Japan's remaining G pilot pool was dwindling rapidly. Flight schools were graduating students with less than 50 hours of flight time, barely enough to take off and navigate, much less engage in combat. These minimally trained pilots were particularly vulnerable to disorientation and smoke. They lacked the instrument skills or situational awareness to recover from visual confusion. American intelligence officers analyzing captured documents and interrogating prisoners found consistent themes. Japanese aircrews described smokescreens as the white wall or the fog curtain. Several diaries recovered from crashed aircraft contained entries expressing frustration and hopelessness. One particularly poignant passage written by a 20-year-old pilot the night before his final mission read, "Tomorrow I will fly to Okinawa. They say the Americans have covered the ocean with white fog. I do not know if I will see my target. I do not know if my death will matter, but I will go because there is nothing else." The entry was dated April 15th. His aircraft was shot down over the East China Sea, never reaching the fleet. The psychological damage extended beyond individual pilots to unit cohesion. Kamikaze squadrons traditionally operated with near-religious certainty. Pilots encouraged each other with promises that their deaths would be glorious and meaningful. But as smokescreens became standard, that certainty eroded. Survivors returning from aborted missions spread doubt. Some units experienced what would now be recognized as morale collapse. Pilots began reporting mechanical problems before takeoff, sometimes sabotaging their own aircraft to avoid missions. Others simply disappeared, walking away from air bases into the countryside. Japanese military police investigated these desertions, but enforcement was inconsistent. The entire structure of coercion and honor that sustained the Kamikaze program was fracturing. By contrast, American morale, while strained by continuous combat, was reinforced by technological confidence. Sailors trusted that their ships had defensive systems that worked. They had seen smoke-save vessels. They had watched radar-guide fighters to intercepts. They had witnessed anti-aircraft fire, coordinated by sophisticated directors, shoot down attackers at distances that would have been impossible 3 years earlier. This confidence didn't eliminate fear, but it provided a rational basis for hope. Men could believe they would survive not through luck alone, but through the competence of their equipment and the skill of their crews. The logistical machinery supporting smoke operations expanded rapidly. By late April, every major port facility in the Pacific Theater allocated warehouse space specifically for smoke-generating chemicals. Sulfur trioxide production in the United States increased by 300%. Shipping priorities placed smoke supplies at the same level as aviation fuel and ammunition. Destroyers returning from picket duty for resupply received chemical reloads automatically. The Navy established dedicated training schools where crews practiced smoke deployment under simulated attack conditions. What had been an experimental tactic in March was now a formalized doctrine with standardized procedures, equipment specifications, and training curricula. Technical improvements continued. Engineers developed smoke generators with higher output and longer operational duration. New chemical formulations created denser fog with better persistence in high winds. Some experimental systems used multiple chemical compounds in sequence, layering different smoke types to achieve opacity across a broader spectrum of light wavelengths. These refinements were tested in combat immediately. Okinawa served as a proving ground where innovations could be deployed as assessed and refined within days. The pace of development was extraordinary, driven by the daily reality of kamikaze attacks and the measurable effectiveness of smoke countermeasures. Japanese intelligence was fully aware of these developments. Reconnaissance flights photographed smoke-shrouded fleets. Radio intercepts captured American communications discussing smoke deployment. But knowing about the smoke and countering it were entirely different problems. Japan lacked the technological infrastructure to equip pilots with instruments necessary for blind attacks. Radar-guided weapons existed only in prototype form. The industrial capacity to mass-produce countermeasures had been destroyed by strategic bombing. Japanese planners understood they were facing a defensive system they could not defeat with available resources. The best they could hope for was to exploit gaps and pray for favorable winds. On April 16th, USS Laffey faced the ultimate test. Over the course of 80 minutes, 22 aircraft attacked the lone destroyer stationed at Radar Picket 1. The ship deployed smoke continuously, maneuvering to keep the fog between herself and attackers. The smoke didn't prevent the assault, but it disrupted timing and coordination. Aircraft that should have attacked simultaneously arrived staggered, allowing Laffey's guns to engage each individually. Several kamikazes dove into the smoke and emerged so disoriented that they missed entirely. 5 aircraft struck the ship and 4 bombs hit, but Laffey remained afloat. Post-battle analysis concluded that without smoke, the destroyer would have faced concentrated attacks she could not have survived. The smoke hadn't saved her from damage, but it had saved her from destruction. The story of Laffey spread rapidly through the fleet. She became a symbol not just of courage, but of survivability through technology. Sailors understood that bravery alone wouldn't stop a kamikaze, but bravery combined with smokescreens, radar, fighter cover, and concentrated firepower could. The combination was imperfect, but it shifted the odds. In a war of attrition, shifting odds from hopeless to survivable was the difference between victory and defeat. By early May 1945, the kamikaze campaign had entered a phase of diminishing returns that Japanese commanders could no longer ignore. Kikusui operations 3 through 7 launched between April 16th and May 25th, each deploying between 100 and 165 aircraft. The results followed a grim pattern. Fewer than 15% of attacking aircraft achieved hits. The ratio of aircraft lost to ships sunk widened from 3 to 1 in early April to nearly 10 to 1 by late May. Japan was burning through its remaining air strength at a pace that guaranteed total exhaustion before summer's E. The smokescreens were not solely responsible for this collapse, but they were a critical factor in the equation that made continuation strategically irrational. American after-action reports quantified the smoke's contribution with clinical precision. Ships operating with active smoke coverage experienced hit rates of 4.2% during this period. Ships without smoke coverage experienced hit rates of 11.8%. The difference represented hundreds of lives saved and dozens of vessels kept operational. Fleet commanders began requesting smoke capability as a prerequisite for hazardous assignments. Destroyers on radar picket duty without smoke generators were rotated out and refitted. The invisible wall had become so integral to naval operations that its absence was considered an unacceptable risk. The psychological toll on surviving Japanese pilots manifested in ways that transcended individual morale. Entire units developed what modern psychology would recognize as learned helplessness. Pilots who had flown multiple missions and repeatedly failed to find targets through smoke began to exhibit fatalistic resignation rather than determined resolve. Some flew their missions mechanically, diving into fog without real expectation of success, dying not from warrior spirit but from procedural compliance. Others flew aggressively but recklessly, attempting to break through smoke at angles and speeds that made controlled impact impossible even if they found a target. The smoke had transformed the kamikaze from a precision weapon into a blunt instrument that harmed its wielder as much as its target. Captured documents from this period reveal Japanese command struggling with the smoke problem at the highest levels. Admiral Suemu Toyota, chief of the Naval General Staff, received multiple reports recommending suspension of mass kamikaze operations pending development of effective countermeasures. His response, dated May 18, 1945, was stark. There are no countermeasures, there are no reserves, there is only the attack. Continue operations. The statement reflected not strategic planning but strategic exhaustion. Japan had committed to a course of action that no longer functioned but possessed no alternative. The smoke had not forced a change in Japanese tactics because Japan had no other tactics to adopt. Allied confidence grew in proportion to Japanese despair. By mid-May, American naval commanders began reducing combat air patrol densities over smoke-protected formations, reallocating fighters to offensive missions against Japanese airfields. This was a calculated risk based on data showing that smoke plus anti-aircraft fire alone could defeat most attacks. The decision proved correct. On May 11th, a kamikaze raid of 35 aircraft attacked a task group operating under full smoke coverage with reduced fighter support. 31 aircraft were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire or crashed in confusion. 4 hit ships, causing damage but no sinking. The Americans had achieved a defensive efficiency that allowed offensive reallocation of assets, a strategic flexibility Japan could not match. The human stories embedded in these statistics were often lost in operational reports, but they persisted in individual memories. Seaman Briggs, the sailor who operated smoke generators aboard Laffey, was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his actions on April 16th. The citation noted that he maintained smoke generation while under direct attack, remaining at his station despite shrapnel wounds and fire danger. Briggs never considered himself heroic. In letters home, he described his role as keeping the fog machine running. But his actions, multiplied across hundreds of sailors on dozens of ships, created the cumulative effect that blunted Japan's final aerial offensive. Japanese survivors carried different memories. Those few pilots who returned from multiple missions and lived to see the war's end often struggled with survivor's guilt magnified by futility. They had not died, but neither had they accomplished anything. The smoke appeared in their accounts as an almost supernatural barrier, something that defied logic and training. One pilot interviewed in 1952 described it this way: "We were taught that determination could overcome any obstacle. But you cannot be determined to see through fog. It is not a matter of will, it is a matter of impossibility." The statement captured the existential crisis the smoke imposed on Japan's warrior culture. Technological lessons learned from Okinawa influenced post-war naval doctrine profoundly. The U.S. Navy's immediate post-war analysis identified smokescreens as one of the top 5 defensive innovations of the Pacific Campaign, alongside radar, proximity-fused shells, fighter direction, and damage control. The report recommended continued development of smoke systems for future conflicts. During the Korean War, smokescreens saw limited use, primarily for obscuring amphibious landings. But the underlying principle that denying the enemy visual information could be as effective as destroying the enemy became foundational to electronic warfare doctrines that emerged in subsequent decades. The chemical legacy was more troubling. Many sailors who operated smoke generators or served aboard ships repeatedly exposed to chemical fog developed respiratory problems in later life. The sulfuric acid particles, while not immediately lethal, caused cumulative lung damage that manifested as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma, and increased cancer rates. The Veterans Administration eventually recognized smoke exposure as a service-connected disability, but many affected sailors had died before compensation became available. The invisible wall that saved lives in 1945 extracted a delayed cost that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. By June 1945, kamikaze attacks had declined to sporadic raids of a dozen or fewer aircraft. Japan's air reserves were nearly exhausted. Pilot quality had deteriorated to the point where many attackers could barely control their aircraft in normal conditions, much less through smoke while under fire. The Kikusui operations officially ended on June 22nd. Final statistics showed that of approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties launched during the Okinawa campaign, fewer than 300 achieved hits. American losses totaled 36 ships sunk and 8 damaged. Over 4,900 sailors died. These numbers were horrific, but they represented a fraction of what Japan had hoped to achieve. The divine wind had blown itself out against defenses it could not penetrate. American planning for the invasion of Japan anticipated kamikaze attacks on an unprecedented scale. Intelligence estimated Japan retained between 5,000 and 7,000 aircraft for homeland defense, most designated for suicide missions. Projections suggested American losses could exceed 100 ships sunk and 500 damaged during the initial invasion phases. But these projections assumed kamikaze effectiveness rates from early 1945. Planners revising estimates in July incorporating Okinawa experience reduced projected losses by 40%, specifically citing smokescreen effectiveness. The invisible wall was factored into invasion planning as a core defensive capability, expected to save thousands of lives during operations that ultimately never occurred. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August rendered the invasion unnecessary. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The kamikaze threat ended not through attrition or defeat in detail, but through strategic collapse. The smokescreens never faced their ultimate test against the massed homeland defense. Whether they would have held against 5,000 aircraft remains unknowable. What is certain is that they held when they were needed during the 82 days of Okinawa, buying time and preserving lives until the war's end. In September 1945, as American forces occupied Japan, intelligence teams interviewed surviving kamikaze pilots and commanders. The conversations were often awkward, translating between victor and vanquished, but they yielded valuable insights. When asked what single American defensive measure had been most effective, the majority mentioned smokescreens. Not fighters, not anti-aircraft fire, smoke. One admiral, speaking through a translator, said simply, "You made the ocean disappear. We could not fight what we could not see." It was a concise epitaph for a campaign that had cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides and achieved nothing but suffering. The invisible wall that protected American ships off Okinawa was not made of steel or fire. It was made of chemistry, wind, and the simple truth that courage cannot compensate for blindness. In the final accounting of the Pacific War, the smokescreen occupies a modest place among the great innovations, less celebrated than radar, less dramatic than the atomic bomb, less tangible than the aircraft carrier. Yet for the thousands of sailors who stood on deck and watched white fog roll across the ocean between them and death, it was everything. It was the difference between a target and empty water, between a ship sailing home and a ship at the bottom of the sea. The kamikaze represented Japan's attempt to transform spiritual conviction into strategic effect, to prove that willpower could overcome material disadvantage. For a time, it worked. The terror of watching a man deliberately fly into your ship knowing he welcomed death as you feared it was profound. But terror is not the same as effectiveness, and determination cannot navigate through chemical fog. The smokescreens did not defeat the kamikaze through superior courage or firepower. They defeated it by removing the precondition for any attack, the ability to see the target. In doing so, they exposed the fundamental vulnerability of a tactic that depended entirely on human vision and human will. The legacy of the invisible wall extends beyond tactical history into the philosophy of warfare itself. It demonstrated that survival sometimes requires not destroying the enemy but denying him information, that the absence of something can be as powerful as the presence of overwhelming force. Modern militaries understand this principle through electronic warfare, stealth technology, and cyber operations that obscure rather than obliterate. But the lesson was written first in chemical smoke drifting across the Pacific, saving lives not through violence but through obscurity. The men who made the smoke, deployed it, and survived because of it rarely spoke of it as heroic. It was simply a tool like a wrench or a radio, but tools matter. In war, the right tool at the right moment can mean the difference between annihilation and survival. The smokescreen was that tool. And in the white fog that rolled across the ocean in the spring of 1945, thousands of young men found something more valuable than glory. They found tomorrow. That invisible wall, temporary and chemical and imperfect, gave them the future. And that was enough.